Engineering, Material Science, Metals Lab Feedback. In this podcast, I'll be going through the general feedback regarding the Metals Lab report that was submitted, and I'll be outlining what really I was looking for and where marks were lost. Okay, so let's start off by just going through what the format was. I was looking really for the lab report to follow this chronological order: abstract, introduction, experimental, methodology, results and discussion, conclusion, and then references and bibliography. And you can see in yellow is the breakdown of how the marks were allocated. So what I'm going to do now is kind of elaborate on these sections and talk about where marks were lost and what essentially I was looking for. Okay, so here's the report feedback. So there were 5% each for the two parts of introduction, likewise for the experimental, 10% in two categories for the results, and then there were three categories for the discussion: 10%, 10% and 20%. Okay, so I'm just going to elaborate on these areas. A further breakdown of marks is available on Extreme. In Extreme, what I've uploaded is like a spreadsheet with where or how much marks were scored in each of these categories. So you can look through, see where you scored highly and where you lost marks. Okay, so this is available under feedback folder on Extreme. First of all, abstract. This should essentially be ideally one paragraph, talking about briefly what was done, in other words, what the experimental was about, and a very brief summary of findings. It's as simple as that. Now, some people, they gave a bit too much information here about what the experiment was about. It's essentially to conduct tensile tests on two different steel samples with differing carbon content to ascertain the influence of carbon on the strengths of steels. And then in your summary, what I was looking for is basically that as the carbon content is increased, the strengths or the tensile strength of the steel increases. So that is essentially what I was looking for in abstract. Next, the introduction. It should be about two paragraphs long. It didn't matter if you had 3 or 4 paragraphs, but essentially looking at two sections. First section is an introduction to the metal steel. Now, in any report, in any introductory part, you bring the reader aware of what is being investigated. In this case, it's steel. Quite a few, disappointingly, forgot to mention that. All I was looking for is just to mention what steel is, what it is made of, and what it is used in civil engineering for. All this is pretty much self-explanatory, but it had to be included in this section. The second part is summarising the aims and objectives of this experiment. So here, what you should have said is the aim and or the objectives is, and then kind of bullet points of what we were looking to investigate. And in this case is to conduct tensile tests on 2 different steel samples with the carbon content being different, and then to elucidate the effect of carbon on the tensile strength. And this is all that I was looking for. So 5% here. Next, the experimental or methodology. Again, this should be comprising 2 sections. The first section is the list of apparatus and materials. It's like, as I said, it's like a recipe for how to do this experiment. So when it comes to, for example, cookery, you'll find initially it's a list of ingredients and then a method of how to cook a particular dish. So here we start out with a list of materials and apparatus. Here I was looking for the full description of the materials, what they were, the carbon content, etc., and what machinery was used. It would have been ideal if some illustrations, especially of the Denison machine, was included. Okay, so this helps the reader understand what needed to be done. The second part is a simple procedure of the experimental task. It's a bit like a step-by-step guide from the start to the finish. A lot of people scored quite well in this section, so a credit to most of you. So that is the experimental and methodology section. Next is the results. Again, should be in 2 sections. Section 1 is the statement of equations used and the working out for the answers. So a lot of you put down what the equations were, and from the graph how we deduced the particular mechanical properties. For example, the yield strength, the proof stress, the method of the 0.2% proof stress, the ultimate tensile strength, and the Young's modulus. So quite a few people, in fact quite a lot of people, did well in this section. And the second part is the correct plot of graphs. And again, the vast majority did well in this section. Marks were lost for the incorrect plot of graphs and also the if the axes were not labelled. Extra marks were given if you tabulated your results, so it made it easier to read. Okay, so there were an extra couple of marks or so available for the general presentation of the results. And furthermore, some people just put in figures and graphs. It seemed a bit incoherent. What I was looking for is just a few lines of text here and there saying figures blah 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 or table blah 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 shows the graphs or the kind of experimental data deducted from this experiment. Now, I didn't penalise people for including the results, but quite a few, quite commendably, put in the experimental data results at the end as an appendix. So I applaud the individuals who did that. Okay, so that's the results. Now, first part of discussion. For this part, marks were allocated for correctly and succinctly discussing the results, i.e. the comparison between the 2 different steel samples. Okay, so how did the kind of various properties differ? So this is part A. Part B is the elaboration of mechanical properties. So for this part, marks were allocated for for correctly elaborating on the mechanical properties. In other words, what does tensile strength, yield strength, modulus of elasticity, what do they mean? I was looking for individuals to basically regurgitate what I'd been through during the lecture. And extra marks were awarded if this was illustrated on the graphs, just the way I'd done so in lectures 2 and 3. Okay, so this is the part B for the discussion session. And the third part of discussion is the effect of carbon. This should have been the easiest 20 marks that you could have picked up. Essentially what I was looking for in your discussion is to make these 5 points. The effect of carbon on steel increases tensile strength, increases yield strength, it makes it harder, it reduces ductility, and very importantly, it does not affect stiffness. 4 marks for each point, hence 20 marks. Very few, quite disappointingly, managed to score 20 out of 20. Conclusion should be 1 paragraph long, talking about very briefly what was done in this experiment and a very brief summary of findings. It's just as simple as that. And references and bibliography. Marks were awarded for quality and variety of references and the presentation. Okay, so this was, again, there was a mixed response to this. Some people did very well, others did not include enough references. Okay, but I was looking at quality rather than quantity. Okay, so this concludes the feedback podcast for the first lab report. If you do have any questions, please contact me by email, and I'll be very happy to elaborate any questions or queries you may have. Okay, so just in case you were thinking, this podcast was conducted by the module leader, Ash Ahmed. Okay, thank you. One other thing that I forgot to mention is that the marks were lost for using I, he, she, you, we. What is always used in lab reports or any technical report is it can be seen, or the objective of the experiment was to do this or do that. Never ever in any report use I, he, she, you or we. Marks will automatically be deducted. Also, figures and tables were not being correctly labelled or included. If you look through my lecture notes, another presentation with the lecture notes, you will see precisely how figures and tables should be labelled. And all sections were not correctly labelled or included in the right order. Most of you had it in the right order that I talked about at the beginning of this podcast, but some kind of mixed discussion results, bibliography, etc., in different orders. So marks were lost for that. Okay, so on that note, I conclude this